Let's talk about the trade deficit because the 2025 trade deficit, well, it does look deceiving. Some people are saying that the tariffs didn't work because the trade deficit in 2025 only fell to about 901.5 billion from just under 903 billion in 2024. However, if you break down the numbers, which we love doing, quarter by quarter, it tells a different story. Now, the first 3 months of the year, there was a $400 billion trade deficit, but then each quarter after that, it began to decline. In the second quarter, it fell drastically, cut in half, to $180 billion in the second quarter trade deficit.
And there wasn't much change in the third quarter with a slight drop to $175 billion. But then in Q4, there was a drop to $145 billion. We try to explain to people that the U.S. economy at $31.5 trillion is like a big ship in the ocean. You can't turn it quickly. It's not like a little speedboat, right? Or a jet ski is maybe a better example where you can whip that thing around. These massive ships, they take a long time to get kind of turning there. If people would be patient, I do think, and I'm going to say, I think we would have seen by the end of 2026, there would be further progress, and I believe it's possible the trade deficit could see a decline to somewhere around $600 to $700 billion based on the fourth quarter of 2025 and the data that we got there.
And again, we're not just pulling out of the head. It's just common sense. You can see it declining. You can see it start working. And Chase, as you said, it takes a long time to turn things around. And unfortunately, people just too doggone impatient, saying, well, it's been 6 months, nothing's happened. Like, it makes no sense to me.
I do think, this is where you and I might disagree. I don't know if the 145 was a little bit generous, because I think it was just so hard to see, frankly, how much the tariffs impacted, because when they were announced, you had this huge influx of imports, and it totally distorted it. And then you had companies that were working through that inventory throughout the year. And I don't know if necessarily we'd be at a run rate for the full year in 2026 at, $145 billion for Q4, but I definitely think it would have been lower this year than it was in 2025. But again, it takes time to work through these things, not, as you said, 6 months. So it's I'm not going to say necessarily my opinion if I think it's right or wrong on the tariffs, but I think using this as an example of they did or did not work is a poor way to evaluate it.
Yeah, and again, it takes time. And again, the 145 could be a low number, and that's why we said for the estimate for the rest of 2026 would be 600, maybe 700 billion. They're not going to go away. You're going to have that trade deficit, but it can be reduced. And what happens when you do that is that hopefully more manufacturing is done here in the U.S. to create more jobs here, and the use of AI is going to help as well. So there's many benefits to that. We're not going to see a trade surplus, I don't think, anytime soon. But to reduce that deficit is a huge thing because we keep sending our money overseas. And I do know there's a snafu with the Supreme Court ruling that the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, which was first used in the first quarter last year to implement many of the tariffs, was ruled illegal. Well, but there are other ways to impose tariffs, such as Section 122 of the Trade Act of 1974 or Section 301 of the Trade Act that the president used in his first term, also available in the Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act of 1962. I mean, there's other things that can be done for tariffs.
Yeah, and again, I don't want to necessarily... Tariffs are, in my mind, a complicated situation. So, I'm not going to say I'm pro or anti-tariff. I'm pro-free trade long-term, but if other companies aren't playing by free trade, well, you got to try and make them play free trade. But I will say I was glad the Supreme Court overturned the tariffs, because it again is sticking to the Supreme Court not being a political body, which I think was an important action that a lot of people were very worried about with the Trump appointees in the Supreme Court. But again, they said, oh, this is the Constitution, these are the rules, and frankly, they stuck by the rules, which I thought was a good thing for this country. But with that said, I don't believe the Supreme Court ruling will ultimately lead to an end of tariffs, as the administration will look at these other avenues that you discussed. And I got to say, one other positive from these tariffs, was it got us talking to other countries and negotiating with other countries about, hey, let's do more trade, let's have you invest more in the country. Ultimately, that is good to have those discussions, in my mind, in the long term.
And actually, one thing I looked at was I think it's a Trade Act of 1974 the whole thing's like 300 pages. You said they're confusing. They're very confusing. That's why it's not just a one-page thing. And that's one. You got the 1974. You got the Expansion Act of 1962. There's subsections. It's a very complicated thing. So there's other things that can be done, and things can change. But again, they are helpful until we get that free trade. So that's what we're kind of working for there.